Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this traditional opening morning session at Davos on the global economy. My name is Michael Elliott. I'm the editor of Time International. This session's done in collaboration with us at Time Magazine and our partners at CNBC, who are filming right now and will make a half-an-hour program of our discussion this morning. When we did this session 2 years ago, most of the panel seemed to agree that the world economy, in that famous phrase, was at a Goldilocks stage. It was like the bowl of porridge in the fairy tale. It was neither too hot nor too cold. It was warm and comfortable. If you extended the analogy now, you'd probably say that the world economy was rather like one of those breakfasts that you used to get served in the lesser sort of Scottish boarding house, where you were presented with a bowl of porridge that was cold and glutinous and turning up at the edges with a couple of flies dancing a lazy Highland reel on its surface. To see whether we can warm up the global economy, I have the usual star-studded cast for this opening morning session with us. A huge pleasure to welcome to this session Trevor Manuel, Minister of Finance of South Africa, one of the most distinguished and experienced finance ministers around, and also a newcomer, Justin Yifu Lin, Senior Vice President and Chief Economist of the World Bank in Washington, D.C. I have Ferit Sahenk, Chairman of the Dogus Group from Turkey with me, Heizo Takenaka from Keio University in Japan, and himself an extremely experienced observer and indeed participant in Japan's travails, if you like, in the 1990s, and the Cassandra of the World Economic Forum, Stephen Roach, Chairman of Asia, Morgan Stanley, joining us from Hong Kong. Steve, let's start with you. Let's resist the temptation to look back at what's happened in the last year. Tell us what we can look forward to.
Thanks, Michael. Just one correction for the record. I've been in this panel now for 10 years in a row, but with one exception, 2 years ago.
Correct.
When I was banished from this panel for being too bearish.
Correct.
In any case...
that was the Goldilocks panel.
I like porridge too, but not the way she does. We cannot underestimate the challenges and the dangers that the world economy faces in 2009. This will most likely be the first year since the end of World War II when world GDP actually contracts, driven by a synchronous downturn in the developed world, which we've never seen before, and in the export-led developing world, where the hopes and dreams of decoupling have been shattered, every major developing economy is either slowing or in outright recession, including the cherished BRICS. So in looking to the future, Michael, which is what you've asked me to do, I would really draw your attention to two key drivers for the global economy. And please, don't be offended if you're not one of the drivers, especially those of you from Europe. But on the demand side of the global economy, look to the American consumer. And we've had a very steep decline in U.S. consumption in the past 2 quarters, but it's only the beginning. By my calculations, only about 20% of a multi-year Japanese-like adjustment has occurred for the American consumer. There's obviously a good deal more to come. On the supply side of the world economy, look no further than the Chinese producer. The GDP out of China was reported at plus 6.8% on a year-over-year basis for the fourth quarter last week. But on a sequential quarter-to-quarter basis, the GDP actually declined a little bit. China drives the supply side because so much of the world, but especially Asia, has become China-centric in providing inputs into the Chinese supply chain. For example, in Taiwan last month, exports were down 42% year on year. The Chinese piece was down 55%. In Japan, exports in December were down 35%. The Chinese piece was minus 35%. In Korea, exports were down 17%. The Chinese piece minus 35% as well. So China's driving Asia. And as the Chinese economy has really hit a wall here, the rest of Asia is following suit. My conclusion, Michael, is we had an extraordinary boom in the global economy in the 4.5 years ending in mid-2007, nearly 5% global growth over that 4.5-year period. We won't see that 5% for many, many years. Over the next 3 years, the best I can see is only 2.5% average growth in the world. That's a near recession outcome over that 3-year period, a halving of the global growth rate. Recovery, when it comes later this year, early next year, anemic at best.
Heizo, not so long ago, thank you, Steve. Heizo, not so long ago, the Japanese experience in the 1990s was regarded almost as a historical curiosity that others were unlikely to repeat. Suddenly, the Japanese experience in the 1990s is one that is in people's minds because they fear it might be repeated. Tell us, from your experience, how the world economy looks now, what worked when you tried to kickstart the world's second largest economy in the 1990s, what didn't work, and what lessons can be learned.
Well, thank you, Michael, for this opportunity. First of all, I'd like to say, Steve said expected 2.5% growth. He's much more optimistic than expected, actually, today. But anyway, in 1990s, we had a very serious experience of so-called lost decade. The current situation is something more than financial crisis and more than economic crisis. That is, what we face is confidence crisis. The confidence is the base of our economic activity, actually. So once so-called confidence crisis occurred, the role of the government is very important. We need a strong government and a strong central bank. However, at the very first stage, politics are very reluctant to take some kind of action. Government activism, they are reluctant about to take this government activism. But once this activism starts, we have now faced another risk of over-activism. That actually we experienced in Japan. And anyway, first of all, capital injection is in a sense something like a symbol of the government activism. And I understand the United States and European countries are ready to take this action of capital injection. But based upon experience in Japan, capital injection is needed. But this is not enough. That's our experience. In 1999, we injected a huge amount of capital to commercial banks. But even after that, for 4 years, our financial crisis continued. What we need now is accurate assessment of asset, accurate measurement of asset. Otherwise, we cannot get the concrete amount. What amount of capital injection is needed or not? Under such circumstances, we, in 2002, when I was nominated as Minister for Financial Services, we again created a new plan for the disposal of non-performing loan. In this plan, we had a very strict rule for the asset assessment. However, we experienced in 1990, that's a banking crisis. But we are now facing money market crisis. The situation is much more complicated, and asset assessment is much more difficult here. This is the problem that we are experiencing. And during that time, for the time of balance sheet adjustment, so-called macroeconomic stimuli is needed. And I understand also the United States, European countries, and China are ready to this kind of action. However, we cannot continue this kind of action for a long time, maybe 2 years, 3 years. During that period, quick action is needed to stabilize the situation. So finally, I'd like to say, so quick action is needed. In order to realize quick action, political leadership is very important. From a viewpoint of politics, sometimes they are very reluctant to use public money, considering the taxpayers' consideration. But anyway, strong leadership is needed to take a quick action. And that's exactly what we need now.
Justin, let me come to you. Steve said 2.5%. Heizo thought that might be a little optimistic. What's the World Bank's view? And in particular, give us a sense of how this crisis, which started, or is perceived to have started in the rich world, is affecting the developing world. We've seen substantial economic growth, not just in the BRICS, but elsewhere. I want to bring Trevor in on that in a second. Give us some sense of how this rich world crisis is affecting the poorer world.
Well, first I agree that there's a lot of downside risks. And the current projection might be possible to have a protracted recession, and we have not reached the bottom yet. That's my first response. And secondly, I agree that decoupling is impossible. In the previous 5 years, we saw very dynamic growth in the developing country for several reasons. The trade increased the opportunity for the developing country, and also the large capital inflow to the developing country. We know that in 2007, it reached $1 trillion. And also the commodity price boom gave many commodity-rich countries the opportunity for investment growth. And also remittance increased because of the rapid economic growth in the high-income country. And now all those is going to reverse. So with that, the developing country, including countries in Africa, are affected very seriously. And how we are going to emerge from this crisis, I think it very much depends on how we are going to handle this crisis. And also agree with Heizo that capital injection to the financial sector is not enough. We need to have a coordinated fiscal responses, stimulus, and large enough and coordinated. But how to do that? I think we need to have a new multilateralism that the G7 country, BRICS countries, and the developing country can come together to get into some kind of consensus for action. That's one thing. And secondly, if we want to have a coordinated fiscal stimulus, then we know many developing countries, they don't have those fiscal space. They are also constrained by the foreign reserve, foreign exchanges. So under this kind of situation, we also need to have a mechanism to transfer some resources, funding from the developed country to the developing country. So for that, I agree that we need to have something like recently proposed by my president, Zodek, about the vulnerability fund to transfer some resources to the developing country. And if we can do that, after the crisis, we are going to have a much better, cooperative, coordinated, and sustainable, inclusive growth in the world.
Trevor, Manuel, let's pick up some of those points. One of the points, one of the issues that we noted at this session last year was that Africa had 5 years of historically high rates of growth. You could see some poverty reduction on the back of high commodity prices and growth in world trade. What has the crisis done in your region and in other parts of the developing world?
Thanks a lot, Michael. I suppose the debate last year was about decoupling, but now, looking at Africa, it's a risk of decoupling, derailment, and abandonment together. Because, so much of the Africa project has been work in progress, and if we look at the conduct now in respect of the developed world, there's a much higher level of protectionism, especially as fiscal resources plow in. Secondly, I think that there's a risk that Africa's markets will be flooded by the need to stimulate consumer demand somewhere, anywhere in the short term. Thirdly, I think I know that we're seeing a retreat of some of the investments. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, there are some 48 different mining projects that are in various stages of abandonment now. It's also important to take account of two other issues. The one is that countries that had taken the tough decisions of macroeconomic reform and then been able to access capital markets are now crowded out. The markets are effectively closed. And lastly, I think that there's an enormous risk that the ODA committed is unlikely to flow. At last count, we're already $240 billion US dollars behind the Glen Eagles commitment. So I think that the short-term prospects for Africa are exceedingly difficult. And this is what we must respond to. I think the bigger challenge, though, is just now we read this, and I know you said to Stephen that we shouldn't look back, and I disagree. I think we must understand what has taken place, not as though we are collectively Lot's wife, but we need to understand exactly what has happened. And I think that one of the biggest failures of the past era has been a failure of multilateralism. We've tended to treat states as debtors and creditors rather than as co-responsibles, and that has to change, and I think that this must be part of the emphasis going forward. The other point, and just to pick up on something that Justin had raised, there is a risk that the hurried interventions on both the monetary and fiscal side will lead to naught. We're seeing a kind of lemming-like approach, trying to get to the precipice first without any idea of what that money is going to buy. And I think that you're going to end up with wealthy states exceedingly indebted in the future and not much to show for it. And that, I think, is what we must try and avoid by cooperation that's quite different and perhaps more measured than what we've seen thus far. Thanks.
Ferit, tell us how this looks, not from the standpoint of a finance ministry or indeed a financial institution, but from the standpoint of what we often call the real economy. In other words, companies producing goods and services, trying to sell in a market that is in economic turmoil.
Thank you very much. For the first time here on the panel, maybe the reason is that this is probably in Turkish history, I come from Turkey, it's the first crisis that we didn't create. If you're going to ask any solutions from me, well, we had a very strong and tough IMF program, 2001 and 2002, and it worked. But the main thing was that the country got together, committed herself, all the stakeholders together, and stood behind it, collectively. Maybe this is a small picture of the world, but this is probably what we need in the grand picture in the world today. Collective action together. Who has what, who doesn't have what, that's not a problem. But if you don't do it together, at the end, in the long run, we are all dead. But let's create a world together better. Well, in order to understand emerging markets, I think it's very important that the last 10, 12 years, we enjoyed an unbelievable globalization effect. My country did a lot of structural changes. Money flew to Turkey, foreign direct investments, private equity investments, all types of investors were coming to Turkey. Turkey was growing. But now we are in crisis. The money is pulling out from all the markets. There is deleveraging. And this is naturally creating a liquidity squeeze. And this is bringing about a risk of refinancing not only the banks, but also the private sector debt. Mm-hmm. This is very important. Secondly, I have some numbers here. According to certain studies, the net amount of private flows to emerging markets is expected to decline to 165 billion US dollars in 2009. Well, this used to be $900 billion, from 900 to 165. That's quite lessening of foreign flow, private flow to emerging world. So naturally, the real economic players, the companies who are growing, are going to be faced with liquidity problem. Well, moreover, we are seeing certain banks around the world which now are nationalized or capitalized. We are feeling that some governments are encouraging their banks to invest mostly in domestic assets. So this is another wave that I'm very much worried as an advocate of globalization, a new way of protectionism. Right. To solve this, what can be done? I mean, just looking at the Turkey example, and last year in the CNBC debate, I was part of it as well, we were talking about the new role of IMF. Well, should IMF be the police of the world? I think rather than the police of the world, a better definition that I find is that a police to supervise the financial markets. However, today we realize that we need an institution by which we can cooperate and ensure better supervision. This can be an address which can be done collectively, all these desires. Because I believe human resources-wise, IMF has it. They have all the technicians. It's probably one of the few institutions around the world who sees the whole picture somehow better than the others. And but IMF has to change. That's indeed the thing. First, a quota reform is needed in IMF. Second, a fair and a better representation of developing and developed world is needed. This we talked about last year as well. And maybe a radical thing, but IMF should be furnished with the ability to borrow from international capital markets, because sooner or later IMF money is also going to be running out. Of course, these are all together with what my colleague said, but what we need is an urgent thing, because unlike developed world, emerging markets and emerging countries, there is a danger. Mm-hmm. And this is not only unemployment, this is not only poverty. If this crisis goes longer, it will lead to around the world social and political crisis, which we should be keeping in mind. Thank you.
There are points there that we'll come back to, not just in this session, but during the week. Steve and Heizo, I'd like you both to kind of pick up 2 points that Trevor made about the developed world, about risks in the developed world. One, Trevor's phrase that wealthy states are going to see themselves with extraordinarily high levels of debt and not much to show for it. Two, that there is a risk of protectionism as rich economies contract, unemployment rises, and social stresses grow. Steve?
I think those are two key risks. In the United States, monetary and fiscal stimulus is unbounded in its efforts. But you know, the main force at work in the U.S. is a powerful deleveraging of the American consumer. So are zero interest rates going to arrest the need for American consumers to pay down debt and rebuild saving? I think Trevor's point is very, very well taken. The orthodox view that's come out of Washington and embraced by the new Obama administration is that the Fed has pretty much used up its ammunition, so we need massive fiscal stimulus. I'm certainly in favor of a U.S. that has neglected infrastructure, investment in alternative energies, and human capital, of making amends on those counts. But I don't think we can delude ourselves into thinking this is going to jumpstart the U.S. economy. The point on protectionism is very real. In the past 4 years, the U.S. Congress has been leading the way in China bashing. It introduced over 45 separate pieces of anti-China trade legislation. None of them passed. They were introduced in a period of prosperity and low unemployment. And now unemployment's rising. And we have a new Treasury Secretary who, before he was even sworn in, was challenging the Chinese, whose economy is weakening, to appreciate their currency. I've never seen an economy in a recession voluntarily raise the value of its currency. This is tantamount to economic suicide. It's horrible advice given to the Chinese. But it's an example of how very real the protectionist risks are now that we're moving into a period of even more pressure on labor, higher unemployment, and the rising tide of economic nationalism. I think this panel is right to warn of those risks. We cannot take them lightly.
Heizo, do you want to come in?
Yes, first of all, I'd like to say it's amazing that many countries are now discussing fiscal stimuli. According to the traditional theory of economics, under the open economy, fiscal stimuli is not so helpful. Monetary policy is much more important. It's a very important point. I do not deny the need for fiscal stimuli, but in the case of Japan in the 10 years ago, we realized the disposal of non-performing loan without any fiscal stimuli. At that time, we have been suffering from a huge amount of fiscal deficit, but we couldn't use actually. But anyway, monetary policy was used, and very fortunately at that time we were helped by depreciation at that time. But anyway, I do not deny the need of fiscal stimuli, but we cannot rely too much on that because we live in open economy. Monetary policy role is much more important. Also, this is amazing for me. We didn't discuss this moment yet, deflation. Mm-hmm. We had a very serious deflation, and still deflation continuing in Japan. Now, in the case of the United States, our growth rate of CPI is also negative. How to conquer the deflation? The role of central bank is very important. In the case of Japan, we had so-called monetary easing. There are a lot of discussions of that, but the new role of monetary policy, that should be discussed. This is the first point. As for protectionism, I use the term overactivism of the government. A symbol of this overactivism, or a symbol or this protectionism will be seen maybe how the United States government deal with big three, so-called automakers, big three treatment. This should be decided, of course, by the U.S. government. However, if U.S. government take some action to rescue these companies, this will become a very symbolic action of protectionism. We had, of course, very serious problem 10 years ago. Many people asked some big companies to be rescued. But at that time, we had the policy, so-called managed bankruptcy policy, where Industrial Revitalization Corporation of Japan was created. We had that kind of managed bankruptcy. This could be one suggestion that should be considered to avoid the kind of overactivism of the government. But anyway, many people are now watching how the U.S. government deal with big three automakers.
Justin, Steve has twice put on the table, and I think we really kind of have to get to it, the situation in relation to China and China's economic prospects in the next year, and in particular, the crucial, truly crucial bilateral relationship between the U.S. economy and the Chinese economy. A lot of academic literature in the last year looking at the dynamics of that relationship. Tell us what your sense is of growth prospects in China, of what the infrastructure program is likely to do, of what the safety net program is likely to do, what's happening to net exports, and the extent to which we can expect China to pick up some slack.
Well, I think that China has already adopted a fiscal stimulus package of 4 trillion Chinese yuan, and that's equivalent to 580 billion US dollars. And it is about 15% of GDP. And China will implement the policy in the coming 2 years. So that means that each year, the stimulus will be around 7 or 8% of GDP. And we have to say it's a very strong stimulus. And those money will be invested in several areas. One is in the environment-related energy-saving sectors. And the other one is infrastructure. And the third one is social protection. And through that, I'm sure the demand in China will increase. And the growth rate in China can be maintained around 7 or 8%. And that should be considered as a good news for the world. And I also like to say,
and you're confident on 7 or 8%?
Yeah, I think it should be possible. Although last quarters, that the fourth quarter of 2008, because the export reduced dramatically, and also the real estate sector in China is sluggish, and so the growth rate, coming down to about 6.8%. And possibly the first quarter of this year may also, lower than 7%. But I think once the stimulus package is implemented, the growth rate will pick up. Mm-hmm. And so for the whole year, I think it's very likely that it will reach, between 7 and 8%. But I think that the protectionism, the danger is real. And especially during this kind of global crisis, I think the important thing is how to get out of this, recession, and how to maintain growth is very important. And in this regard, I would agree that Stephen said currency appreciation will not contribute to solving of the global imbalance, and is bad for the Chinese growth.
Sorry, no one from the U.S. Treasury is here to take that point. Actually, Trevor, not you. No, not you, not you. But I want to kind of I want to come back to you because you made a sort of impassioned plea for us to remember what went wrong. And as you hear various programs detailed, whether in the U.S. or in Western Europe or in Japan or in China, do you get a sense, first of all, that enough is being done to try and rebalance imbalances in the world economy and get some growth, and secondly, that it is being done in the sort of coordinated way for which you were calling?
I think the short answers to all of that would be no. I mean, I'd like to have a separate debate with Justin about China's growth and where the consumer demand will come from, because China is, after all, the world's workshop. Yeah. But, let's leave that for now. I think that one of the key issues about the past period is what we knew when. I mean, I can't imagine that the U.S. Article 4 report or the IMF's Article 4 report on the U.S. didn't indicate certain things. And what do you do when countries continually ignore the advice of their peers and the advice of multilateralism? What perspective do we take on multilateralism? Because if we don't do that, you see, if we don't start this discussion at that point, then the idea that you can coordinate responses, I think, is unfortunately rather failed. And here, very important questions. I mean, fiscal stimulus clearly is exceedingly fashionable at the moment. But I cannot for the life of me resolve what tens of billions of dollars poured into the Detroit Three will do. Sure, it'll keep companies afloat, but what does it do for industrialization or anything else? What does it do for the real economy beyond sentiment? And you see, it's when we are capable of dealing with these issues quite dispassionately that we can actually understand that we've lived through an era, and perhaps that era has been there. We've now lived through an era from 1944 to the present. And beyond this lies something different. But do political leaders across the world understand that we tied in this together? That shouting from Washington to China at Beijing is not going to make a difference. We tied in this together. There are a set of decisions that we have to take that are rational about the future. That our relations are not relations, and Larry is not here. Larry and I have had this debate because he doesn't talk about multilateralism. He talks about relations between debtors and creditors. My, how the world has shifted. Because unless we can get into that zone, we don't actually place ourselves in a position where we allow ourselves to be advised and understand the extent to which we're all bound in this together. If we don't do this, this picture that I've tried to sketch of Africa will become that for increasingly larger parts of the world.
Steve.
Trevor, can I just ask you a question? I mean, I think we would all agree with you, and my friend here from Turkey said the same thing, that we definitely need a more activist, multilateral approach to global imbalances. The IMF, with great fanfare, 3 years ago, launched this multilateral surveillance and consultation mechanism, and it just disappeared. Nothing happened. I mean, the problem, as I see this multilateral approach, is there's no enforcement mechanism. There's no penalty for bad behavior. There's no reward for good behavior. No one wants to abdicate national sovereignty to multilateral authorities to deal with multilateral issues. And until we get over the idea of having this multilateral watchdog that can talk and bark but has no bite, we're not going to get anywhere. So aren't we just kidding ourselves in talking about the multilateral approach to fixing the world until or unless we give multilateral authorities enforcement power?
Of which you would say there was presently no side.
Zero.
Thank you. Ferit, before we go to questions, I want to come back to your point, because to your intervention, because you put on the table perhaps one of the most important things for people to think about at this year's Davos, which is that the economic crisis that we have started to experience in the last 18 months, and in particular in the last year, may genuinely have political consequences. And the question the specific question that I want to address to you is this: insofar as it is perceived outside the United States that the global economic crisis had its roots in American overconsumption, over-indebtedness, lack of saving, lack of fiscal responsibility, what have you, do you think that the reputation of the U.S. has suffered outside its shores?
Well, some may say yes, but I think I'm more concerned and concentrating on globalization. Because some of the emerging, developing world players, the last 10, 15 years, have gone through such restructuring and have gotten the benefits of globalization. And behind it, while we were doing all these changes or the programs, of course, IMF naturally is always seen as a U.S. entity in these markets. So people are asking themselves, well, we went through all these structural changes, all these reforms, we changed ourselves. Now, why are we being punished? Mm-hmm. What's happening? Yesterday, people are talking about these growth stories about our countries. We did a lot of cultural change, social change, and now we are suffering. It's very easy to point fingers to us. But I think people have to think about this. Last 10, 15 years, a lot of people, as much as the developed world players in the emerging markets, we got the benefit of globalization. And I don't think only one person or one entity or one country should be put to corner as the evil of this happening. I think we all enjoyed this 10, 15 years. Nobody said anything about it. We came here, we discussed it, and after we left Davos, we went back to our companies, we went back home, and things went as usual. As said before me, there was no enforcement. So let's stop blaming people. It's not US, it's not us, it's not them. There is too much us and them in the world today. That's enough. But what's important, I think, as a collective action, G20, I think, is a very important entity as well. And we should not forget this. This is a time for collective action. One thing that I didn't say the last round that I should say this is very important for IMF. IMF is used to structuring programs to governments because in the emerging world, always the governments were the people in need of funds. But now in the emerging world, it's the street, it's the economy, it's the real players in the need of funds. So they have to find a means when if IMF gives funds to governments to transfer or to channel this money, however they are going to do, with whatever restrictions, with whatever rules and regulations, whatever entities they are going to use, channel this money to the economy.
Let's go to the floor. First person to catch my eye, not surprisingly, is Martin Wolf of the Financial Times. He's over there.
First of all, Steve, I'm shocked by your optimism. What is this 2.5% growth nonsense? You're getting soft in your old age. Wait a second, you'll have a chance. The second, everybody had enough of a profligate US. Congratulations, you've got it. The question I have is I'm really confused about what you think, any of you or all of you think should actually be done. We are in the middle of a proto-depression. That's what's happening right now. The world economy is imploding. You don't like fiscal policy. The point was made, it's not a good measure in an open economy. You're very doubtful. The world is a closed economy. And we're talking about the world. What actually does each of you think must be done in detail now to fix this? Not at a generality level, and by whom?
Justin, first.
Well, I agree that the whole world is a closed economy, and fiscal stimulus will not work if only one country or a few countries adopt the approach. So we need to have a coordinated approach implemented by both the developed country and the developing country. And as I say, developing countries face some kind of constraint in their fiscal space and also their external balance. So under this kind of situation, if we are going to have a coordinated global fiscal stimulus, the developed country need to be responsible to transfer some fund to the developing country.
Trevor?
You need a better coordinating mechanism that's capable of actually pointing out what's wrong. You know, in 1997, we took a decision at the annual meetings of the Bank and Fund in Hong Kong that the remit of the fund should be included to financial markets. It's there, it's in the communique. The fund was always prevented from doing anything about it. So, you know, sometimes when we convene, there are glimpses of rationality. And when the interests or when the chips are down, we try and resist change. And I think that this has been the big problem. And I'm saying, and I suppose to some extent Ferit's arguments are resonant. Can you persuade the G20 as a leading group of heads of state to change the way in which we interrelate? Because if you don't have somebody outside of ourselves capable of pointing out what is wrong, capable of supporting across the board on a more equitable basis rather than what we're seeing at the moment, and the large economies are capable of accessing in this moment of a so-called flight to quality, accessing capital markets for themselves alone, regardless of the rest of the world, clearly you're going to have an unevenness in growth into the future. I think that it's a decidedly different era. It's a kind of Keynesian moment like you had at Bretton Woods, and that's what we need to understand. But if heads of state are going to be recalcitrant about change, then you're going to lose this moment, and I think we're going to muddle through for the next decade or so.
Steve, as a skeptic of whether thank you, Trevor, of whether coordination with teeth, if you like, can be done, how would you answer Martin's question?
First, I want to know what Martin's number is for global growth. I'm giving you a 3-year number, Martin. But two things. One, on the financial crisis. I totally agree with Takenaka-san's point. The issue here is to develop a pricing mechanism for toxic assets. All these sort of circuitous ways of doing that are not getting to the heart of the problem. Only then can counterparties understand balance sheet risk on the other side of the table. In the parlance of the U.S., come on, guys, let TARP be TARP. That's what it was designed to do, and no one's willing to do it. In terms of the real economy, get on with the heavy lifting of global rebalancing. Don't delude yourself into believing that massive current account deficits, massive current account surpluses are sustainable. They're not. The deficit economies have to save. That's America. Surplus economies have to consume. That's mainly China. Yeah. And there are tools to go about doing that. That doesn't stop what Martin calls, and I don't agree, that we're in a proto-depression. We're in a global recession, the likes of which we've never seen. I don't know what proto-depression really means, but it's a serious problem. But there's no quick fix for it. And this is a year of outright decline in world GDP. Next year will be a year, we hope, we don't know for sure, of a modest increase.
Anemic growth. Yeah.
Anemic. And our job, or the job of policymakers, is to make that anemic growth a building block for more sustainable growth in the future. We can't do it without fixing the financial system and getting on with the heavy lifting of dealing with these unsustainable global imbalances. It's simple.
Jacob Frankel at the front.
Jacob Frankel. I have a couple of quick observations. First, in the old days, banks were looked at as providers of liquidity and financial resources to the economy. We are now in a situation in which banks' survival depends on absorbing and obtaining liquidity and financial resources from the economy. This is, of course, a necessary process today, but it's abnormal. So the question is, since we were talking a lot about confidence, unless one defines the end point and the exit strategy from which banks' nationalization de facto ceases to be a part of our scenery, we will not really be able to enhance confidence to a large extent in the financial sector. Second point, you were talking about multilateralism, and I think that's really key. Indeed, but one needs to define what will be emerging from this multilateralism. Joint monetary policy has exhausted its instrument. The ammunition is non-existent anymore in the place. Joint fiscal expansion, we are already excessive there. So I think that what we are talking about now is much more focus into the regulatory process, the processes that will improve risk management in the system at large, and this is the thing that once in place will restore confidence. And finally, there is one silver lining. One of the problems last year was that we had an election year in the United States, and we learned the lesson: never have a financial crisis during an election year. We do not have now an election year, so maybe there is a recovery.
Heizo, to you on Jacob's first point on banks.
Yes, I agree that the role of bank is very important. Still, the balance sheet damage of the banks also damage the banking activities. This is causing very serious questions. However, at this moment, we should distinguish capital injection and nationalization. Capital injection and nationalization is completely different one. And basically, for almost all banks, I think capital injection will be the right policy. In case they suffer from deficit, the balance sheet real asset is negative. In this case, in some cases, the nationalization is needed. But we should avoid, at most, this kind of nationalization. Capital injection, the role of capital injection is very much important. That is the first point. Let me raise a short comment on the multilateralism. Well, we have a lot of discussion, unilateralism, multilateralism, issues. However, global effort, regional effort, and bilateral effort we should make use all of them actually. A kind of creative tension is existing between a global effort and regional effort, bilateral effort. So sometimes regional effort give good stimuli to the global effort, multilateralism. We have experienced a lot on this. So my point is, we should make use of all of them, actually. Sometimes unilateralism also important. If one country take a good policy, well, all resources are going to this country, and this will change the total system. So this dynamism among global effort, regional effort, and bilateral effort should be strengthened.
Right at the front here, and then over there.
Yeah, my name is Carter Doherty with the International Herald Tribune and the New York Times. Steve, just please, 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 complete your sentence. Let TARP be TARP by nationalizing the banks. That would strike me as I have yet to hear a persuasive explanation of how you avoid these manifest moral issues of simply bailing out private shareholders by buying up toxic assets without in some way having equity participation, in some cases substantial. I just want somebody to slice that Gordian knot for me. And then for anybody, I'm just curious, because we constantly talking about deficit countries and surplus countries, meaning the U.S. and China. There's also two significant economies, Germany and Japan, that are chronic surplus countries. Japan might be able to let its currency appreciate significantly. The Germans have a trickier issue because of the euro, and their competitiveness was achieved by wage restraint. But I wondered if you had any thoughts about how to crack those problems.
Steve, do you want to go on top first?
I'm not going to complete Carter's sentence for him. I mean, my point is that the problem in balance sheet land for U.S. financial institutions, I think, has been correctly diagnosed as that which pertains to a wide range of toxic assets. Troubled assets is what the T stands for in the program. We tend to call it toxic to make the point. There's been a lot of discussion that because of impaired balance sheets, that banks are unable or unwilling to take on counterparty risk and get about the process of restarting the credit system. And I think the only way to address that is to develop a market a clearing price discovery mechanism that is able to place a value on these assets. That's what TARP was originally designed to do. And then, before the ink was dry, it got transformed into a mechanism for injecting capital. And let's do bridge financing for the big three. Let's use it for foreclosure mitigation, a whole variety of other purposes that were not intended in the mechanism.
So it's time to get back to the original point.
I really believe that needs to be done. And if we want to do other things, let's have our political leaders come up with the courage to say, okay, let's pass a law for foreclosure mitigation. Let's not try to fold it into TARP.
Okay. Ferit, you wanted to come in?
Well, I think, you're not going to innovate or find something new. The recipe is very much there. And when you go to the site of the IMF and you look at the programs designed for the developing world, I can tell you the similar thing that we're talking about banks in the U.S., we went through in Turkey. But one thing was different. It was enforced on us. So it was beyond the political strength of the country. It was enforced on us. If you wanted the IMF support, you were going to do such things. Well, what did we do? First, the shareholders were asked to recapitalize their banks. If they couldn't, the banks were nationalized. If they couldn't have a good activity to continue, they merged, they sold their banks. Now it's a different banking environment. What I think what we are looking for in banking system for the confidence to come back is transparency. Transparency of balance sheets. We do not know what's in those balance sheets. As a demand deposit giver, a private investor, somebody who wants to put money in the banks, what do I want to know? Because every day when I wake up in the newspapers, the international newspapers, I see something about banks. I'm sure if they did a study in the US, one of the rising sales in the retail market is not suits, it's the safety deposit boxes. Transparency is very important for banking. And for this to happen, some of the audit firms that we are criticizing, some of the rating firms we are criticizing, okay, let's stop this. Let's go for this. Ask the shareholders, recap your banks. If you cannot, if you need to nationalize, merge, do whatever, then do audits on these banks and tell the markets, these banks are clean, these banks are right to be active players in the economy, in the world economy. Then you will not face counterparty risks. You will not have any questions about counterparties. Thank you.
Gentleman at the other front here.
Thank you. Fahad Mubarak, Saudi Stock Exchange. The general consensus among the panelists here is that we need an international coordinated effort. And the only obvious organization in the world is the IMF. So my question to Len is, what does the IMF need? Authority, corporate governance, or funding in order to assume such role? And is that possible?
Trevor, Manuel.
It needs all of those things. I'd like to start with reweighting representativity, because these must be truly multilateral organizations. That must be backed with capital. The IMF's capital availability is exceedingly limited. And then I think that the rules, including those that we adopted as early as 1997, to confine the responsibilities not only to monetary policy, but also to look at financial markets, and then to provide a kind of secretariat, I think, for a number of other initiatives, including the G20. But there has to be a rebasing, including, I think, Europe then agreeing that the Eurozone can't be represented by 8 different chairs. So, I think that this is a moment where we can actually look at a very different multilateral arrangement that's more focused and capable of being listened to, and as Steve says, an organization with teeth.
We come to the end of this terrific session. It's been sobering. It's not been particularly joyful and happy, as I suppose nobody expected. We look forward to a tough year ahead. We've had calls for reform of the multilateral institutions to see if we can get more coordinated action to reduce imbalances and find growth, but without a great deal of confidence that will happen. We're not too confident about fiscal stimuli either. Nonetheless, folks, go out and have a great Davos. Thank you very much indeed.